because you're not going to get the amyloid clearance elsewhere in the body, for example, in the liver. And then worse still, the part of the brain that is attacked severely by Alzheimer's disease and atrophies, which is the hippocampus, which is why memory fades, is a part of the brain that is damaged when you stop breathing because of oxygen desaturation. So as an appeal, even if you are not ApoE4 positive, but you are snoring or you know someone who is snoring, go and see your doctor and get a sleep apnea test. It is potentially life-saving.
I actually had a sleep apnea test because of my night awakenings. I didn't know. I was like, maybe
I started, 20 years ago, my PhD was looking at people with degenerative dementias. That's how I actually got into sleep, because I was seeing these sleep abnormalities. And, I'm so desperately trying to find ways to help and to combat that incredible epidemic of dementia. And that's why we've started to try and develop things like electrical brain stimulation methods to try and help actually augment human sleep and electrically supercharge sleep, as it were, to see if we could give back some healthy quality of deep sleep to patients who are aging or those with dementia. Can we essentially, amplify the amount of deep sleep? And in doing so, can we salvage aspects of learning and memory? But better still, could we actually start to increase, the amount of glymphatic clearance of beta amyloid? Now, I suspect that when the disease is in play and you've been diagnosed in those late stages, I don't know how much sleep is electrically charged, even as it may be, could help.
That's why
what we're now trying to do in our studies is actually retrospectively find out, is there a particular decade of life or decade of life when a decline in sleep makes you most susceptible to then developing a lot more amyloid later in life? In other words, we're trying to now identify these vulnerability windows during the lifespan. The reason I want to do that is if I can scientifically convince myself of a knowledge base of vulnerability sensitivity to insufficient sleep. My guess is that it's just across the lifespan. It gives me a chance to know where's the inflection point of not late stage life treatment, but early life prevention. Because that's what medicine has to do right now, I think. We've done a good job at extending lifespan, but a miserable job at extending health span. Lifespan is probably about treatment. Health span is probably about prevention. Sleep needs to be part of that discussion. And sleep is usually absent in many of these conversations for either lifespan or health span, despite it having a demonstrable impact on both. But my hope is that to be able to find that sensitive time where the risk of Alzheimer's development by way of insufficient sleep is present, that's where I go in and start augmenting your sleep with electrical brain stimulation or other methods that we're trying to develop as well.
I think, at least with the ApoE4 positive individuals, by the age of 40, the amyloid plaques start to really...
That's right, yep.
So to me, it would seem that before 40, and certainly when you hit 40, you better have your sleep optimized.
And I would say before, we can see the decline of deep sleep occurring in people in their 20s. That's when your deep sleep starts to decline.
Wow.
Which is, frightening, isn't it? It's sad. And at that point, it's in the male. By the time you're 50 years old, you've lost about 50%.
Altså, når jeg ser weight-klokken, så mener jeg, at du logger bare på til weight, og så logger du af igen, når du er færdig med weight.
By the time you're 70%, there's only about 5%. Sorry, by the time you're 70 years old,
there's only
about 5% of your deep sleep left that you had when you were young and healthy. By the time you're 80, we almost can't detect any of these deep sleep brainwaves anymore.
Do you know if there's changes in the way your core body temperature regulates with age?
There is. So what happens with age is that your circadian rhythm that we spoke about before, your circadian rhythm that we spoke about before, which in healthy people is nice and high and peaking during the day, lots of activity, and then drops down at night, lots of inactivity, lots of deep sleep. That sinusoidal wave starts to flatten out as someone has compressed it as we get older. So our circadian rhythm gets weaker. So we feel sleepier during the day and not as alert as we used to do, but we don't feel as though we are as sleepy at night. We're more awake at night because our circadian rhythm is blunted. And so I think that's another area for aging intervention is how can we modulate the circadian rhythm? And it turns out that it comes back to light. So one of my colleagues in the Netherlands, Urs van Summeren, did a great study where he installed circadian regulating light in an elderly care home, in a home where you care for the elderly. And many of them had cognitive decline, and he's now done some of these studies with people with Alzheimer's disease in some of these care homes. And when you start to create appropriate lighting in the internal environment in these homes, which if you go into them, and I used to go into them all the time during my PhD, these sort of care homes, and I would be testing my patients and seeing my patients there. They were grim environments with dim light, and these patients never got outside. They rarely had a window. And Oos van Summeren, the scientist in the Netherlands, he was able to really produce this strong bout of light during the day inside the care home, and then drop out that light in the evening. And he regularized the light, and he improved the circadian rhythm, and he improved cognitive outcome measures. Wow. Cognition got better in these Alzheimer's patients.
That's cool.
Now, you can look at that same manipulation, that same lighting hack at the beginning of life. So in the neonatal intensive care unit, what we used to have when we go in there, you just have constant light on all of the time, dim light on 24 hours a day, which prevented those infants getting the signal of a regulating 24-hour light-dark cycle. If you regularize light in the neonatal intensive care unit, so light during the day, darkness at night, in these studies, what you see is basically almost a 50 to 60% increase in oxygen saturation within the blood of these neonates in the intensive care unit. Weight gain increases dramatically, and they end up exiting the neonatal intensive care unit about 5 weeks earlier than they would otherwise. Circadian regulation of sleep leads to better health outcomes. It does so in neonates, it does so in the elderly. So I think there's all manner of sleep possible interventions that we can think about across the lifespan when it comes to modifying disease risk at any stage of life.
Yeah, and I think, at least as far as I've, understood from our conversation thus far, some of the main things for prevention in optimizing your sleep really are preventing that emotional stimulation, that anxiety inducing, particularly a few hours before bed, bright light exposure early in the morning, and then not having the bright light exposure, about 4 hours before bedtime, and then the cold, like having your body temperature go down. So, whether that's through something like, having a hot bath or a hot shower, or even possibly the chili pad, which I'm going to actually experiment with.
Yeah.
Because now I've been using this Oura ring that I've been tracking my sleep. By the way, do you know how accurate, so it tells me in my app the light sleep, the REM sleep, and deep sleep. And I know there's nothing going in my brain measuring any sort of brain waves. So it must be movement, right?
I won't say specifically, even though I know the folks at Oura, and I know the folks at almost all of the sleep tracking companies. Most of them right now use a combination of your heart rate, which you can pick up through the pulse waveform, either on the wrist or on the finger, or if it's a bed sensor, through the heartbeat, as well as respiration. And they'll use a combination of those things together with movement to try and stage your sleep. Right now, without naming, I don't think there's anyone that is necessarily better than the other. At least none of them have published scientific evidence. We sleep scientists have actually looked at these devices relative to gold standard, what we call polysomnography, which is essentially like doing a sleep study. If you were to, here at my sleep center, we've got all of this equipment. You look like a spaghetti monster with electrodes on your head.
I don't know anyone can sleep with that on.
Yeah, I know. But we can measure that sleep with high precision, high fidelity. That's the gold standard. And when you compare these sleep trackers, unfortunately, they're not quite accurate. They either overestimate or underestimate sleep onset latency, how long it takes you to fall asleep. They either overestimate or underestimate the amount of time that you've been awake. Sleep duration may not be bad with some of them, a total sleep duration. But once you get into the sleep stages, that's where things become more inaccurate. Their ability to separate non-REM from REM is getting better. It could be in the region of sort of 60% accuracy.
Han neuroforsker.
But right now, we're not there yet. We'll be there in about sort of 4 years' time. I actually think we will be.
But
that's what I'm really interested in, the deep sleep, obviously.
Well, but also I would say REM sleep too. I think REM sleep takes a back seat. It's sort of, a bit of a neglected stepsister in this sort of sleep conversation. REM sleep, we found, serves all manner of different functions, one of which is emotional first aid. It's incredible for a palliative emotional benefit. It's not time that heals all wounds, but it's time during REM sleep that provides emotional convalescence.
I guess that would also then be important to help you sleep better, because if you are managing your emotions better, you probably have less anxiety.
Correct. Exactly. But also REM is for the body too. It seems to regulate cardiovascular function. So REM sleep is critical.
Oh, really? Is REM what's important for the lowering the blood pressure?
No, it's during deep sleep that you get this lowering of blood pressure, and we've got some data right now that we're about to publish that deep sleep provides actually a homeostatic.
Det var fordi, jeg så en anden neuroforskers podcast, der hedder Andrew Huberman. Og det så jeg, fordi han er super interessant. Men jeg startede med at se det på grund af intermittent fasting, som han også... Som han startede ForTiiTude om hvad vi ved, og hvad vi ikke ved. Og så jeg så også nogle af hans andre podcasts, som der bare handler generelt om forskellige ting. Træning, fysiologiske ting, det er hjernen for eksempel. Det er mange underlige ting. Og så havde han så ham her, Matthew, inde. Og så snakkede de om søvn. Fordi at Huberman, han også har snakket om, han har haft nogle afsnit omkring søvn, og hvor vigtigt det er. Og så havde han så Matthew inde. Og det var fucking mindblowing oplevelse. Nu har jeg hørt nogle af hans andre ting, for at finde ud af, om han snakker om nogle... og at der er andre ting. Og så har jeg definitely... Jeg har altid sovet fucking godt. Altid. Jeg falder hurtigt i søvn. Jeg har svært ved at vågne dog. Det tror jeg ikke er det sygeste problem. Men altså, som gamer, jeg tror ikke, der på noget tidspunkt siden jeg har været, jeg ved det ikke, så længe jeg kan huske, har jeg aldrig nogensinde sovet, hverken regelmæssigt, eller meget. Og det var bare mindblowing at få at vide. Man vidste jo godt, man ved jo godt, det er dårligt ikke at sove nok. Jeg havde ingen idé om, hvor dårligt faktisk er. No fucking clue. Det var mindblowing. Det skal jeg definitely, have ændret. Jeg vidste, at det var dårligt at drikke kaffe. Jeg anede ikke, hvornår jeg skulle stoppe med at drikke kaffe. Jeg troede, det var fint, hvis man stoppede med at drikke kaffe kl. 16. Overhovedet ikke. Alt for sent. Så jeg blev bare fuldstændig mindblown. Og så har jeg set nogle af hans andre ting.
Calibration of blood pressure. What do I mean by that? If I measure your blood pressure before sleep and then after sleep at a matched circadian time, so we remove the circadian fluctuation.
Ja, for eksempel, men det er relativt nyt, så har jeg købt koffeinfri kaffe, fordi jeg kan godt lide at drikke kaffe om eftermiddagen og om aftenen, for eksempel. Jeg synes, det er rart med en kop kaffe. Simpelthen bare fordi det smager godt. Nu har jeg købt koffeinfri kaffe. Det har jeg først gjort for en uge siden. Ja, og det er en rigtig dårlig idé. Sådan en, han har snakket om koffein og dens effekt på søvn. Det gjorde mig sygt nederen, fordi det har jeg gjort i så lang tid. Og selv hvis det er, man falder i søvn, efter du har drukket en kop kaffe, så får du ikke, så bliver din kvalitet af søvn bliver så dårlig, at det kan måles på dig dagen efter. At du ikke har fået ordentlig søvn. Det er, at du har sovet 8 timer, og du har ikke sovet ordentligt. Du har ikke fået REM-søvn, og du har ikke fået nok dyb søvn. Fordi koffeinen går ind og irriterer din hjerne, så den ikke kan falde ordentligt i søvn. Og det vidste man jo godt. Jeg anede ikke, hvor slemt det var. Så det gør jeg ikke mere. Aldrig nogensinde. Så jeg drikker ikke kaffe efter 12. Nu. Eller i hvert fald, jeg forsøger. Så vidt som muligt. Nogle gange, så tager jeg en kop kaffe klokken 2. Det smager godt. Jeg kan godt lide det. Ja. Hvis du tager en kop kaffe klokken 2, og går i seng klokken 10, så svarer det til, at du har drukket en kvart kop kaffe. Fordi koffein har en halveringstid på 6 timer. Så klokken... Ja. It's pretty sad. Men altså, jeg tror 12, det tror det. Ja, fucking G. Men det prøver jeg at lade være med noget. Og så drikker jeg koffeinfri kaffe i stedet for. Jeg har været så mindblown og så. Det er fucking hjernedød. Der har virkelig været en masse interessant information.
Of which there is a large one.
Og meget af det super skræmmende.
But we match it, and so the only thing that's different is the quality of your sleep. What we've discovered firstly is that the amount of deep sleep that you have measured in these big delta slow waves during deep non-REM sleep, that predicts how much of a drop in your systolic blood pressure you will have in the morning relative to the evening, as if deep sleep provides a recalibration of the cardiovascular system. If you're having higher frequency brain waves that are not like the deep sleep, that's what we call unrestorative sleep. If you have a ratio of very little deep brainwave activity and a lot of high frequency wake-like brain activity, that what we call a delta beta ratio, that predicts very bad cardiovascular outcomes. That if anything, your systolic blood pressure is even worse after sleep than it is the night before. And what we found is that during aging, now we looked at this in healthy people, then we replicated it in older adults, and we found that the older that you get, the less deep sleep that you get, the more sort of wake-like or faster frequency brainwave activity, which isn't good during deep sleep. And that accurately predicts the cardiovascular dysfunction that we see in aging. So we now think we understand in part why poor sleep is linked to poor cardiovascular outcomes. One of the benefits of sleep is that it resets cardiovascular tone, and particularly systolic tone. It doesn't stop there. There's lots of other benefits, heart rate drops, etc. But REM sleep also seems to have this strange function where you go through these cycles where you get a massive activation of the cardiovascular system, and then it falls silent, and then a massive escalation again. And you get this really remarkable increase in heart rate variability. And heart rate variability has been used as a metric of health outcome, that if you have high heart rate variability, it's very good. It predicts lots of health outcomes. That's what you get during REM sleep. So we should be careful not to think of everything being all about deep sleep. It's about all stages. Every stage of sleep that we have ascribed a function to, which makes sense. You know, during sleep is the most idiotic of all things in terms of a creation from Mother Nature. You know, you're not finding a mate, you're not reproducing, you're not eating, you're not caring for your young, and worst of all, you're vulnerable to predation. So on any one of those grounds, sleep should have been strongly selected against in the course of evolution. The exact opposite is true. Every species that we've studied to date sleeps. What that means is that sleep has fought its way through heroically every step along the evolutionary pathway, which must mean that if sleep doesn't serve an absolutely vital function, it is the biggest mistake that the evolutionary process has ever made. And if any one of those stages of sleep could be removed because it was not important, because I want to, you know, emphasize this type of sleep because that other sleep must not be important, I promise you, Mother Nature would have thought, I'm going to excise that stage of sleep out because you're just too vulnerable. So But I think,
That's hard.
In your position, of course I would be, concerned about my deep sleep, thinking about things like ApoE4 and Alzheimer's risk too. But I think the bottom line is that no matter which way you slice the sleep pie, you just can't shortchange sleep.
I just want to figure out, it'd be nice to know what environmental factors are affecting, different stages of sleep, So it's like, if I do X, then it's going to, affect my deep sleep, or it's going to affect my REM, or it's going to make me miss. For example, if I were to go to bed, let's say I usually go to bed at 9 or 9:30, and if I were to go to bed instead at 11:30 or midnight because I had a social event or something, and my circadian rhythm my circadian rhythm these days is my son. wakes me up at 6 a.m.
Yeah.
But let's just say I could sleep longer if let's say I wake up at 6 a.m., but then I'm like, oh, I went to bed at midnight instead of 9:30. I'll try to go back to sleep. Would that be okay? Would I be able to recover something that I'm missing from the 9:30 to midnight? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So.
Should I go back to sleep? Should I try to go back?
So you should try to go back to sleep. So you should try to get the sleep that you need.
The duration.
The duration. But so there are essentially 4 ingredients, and this is probably going to be my next book, which is essentially the 4 pillars of sleep. Depth, duration, continuity, regularity. If you shortchange sleep on any one of those, you get a compromised deficit in brain and body. So depth is what we were speaking about. It really should be depth/quality of sleep. You need both the depth of those deep sleep brainwaves, but you also need all of these different brainwave oscillations, these things called sleep spindles and slow waves, the coordination between those two. It's all about the electrical quality of your sleep. So you can have the duration of sleep, you can have 8 hours of sleep, but if it's not of the right electrical quality or depth, you get deficits. But you can get lots of high quality sleep, but if you're only getting 4 hours of it, it's not going to be enough. So it's duration, depth, duration. Then it's also about continuity. This has been probably, in the past 5 years, one of the explosions in the sleep field. If you were to get 8 hours of sleep, but across a 9-hour period, because you were awake for 5 minutes here, 10 minutes here, 30 minutes here, 15 minutes here, that's very fragmented sleep, which, by the way, alcohol is another thing that will fragment your sleep very much like that. So the continuity of your sleep is poor. It's not continuous, it's fragmented. And even if you get 8 hours of sleep in a 9-hour period, but it's fragmented, versus you get 8 hours of sleep all in a nice one bout within 8 hours. So in both of those scenarios, it's the same duration of sleep. Maybe it's even the same electrical quality of sleep, but if it's fragmented and littered and punctured with many awakenings, the continuity of sleep is poor, and that's not good either. And then finally, the part is regularity. This means going to bed and waking up at the same time, no matter whether it's the weekend or the weekday. Go to bed at the same time, wake up at the same time. Those are the 4 key pillars that we know of for sleep. And you can hold any one of any 3 constant and manipulate one of them, and you get a deficit. Now, we can't quite weigh the complete, is it, this one is worth, 40%, this one is worth sort of 20%, and this, we can't do that, but it's very clear that those are the 4 pillars of good sleep.
I like it.
So I mentioned that just coming back to, though, the quality of sleep. When you position the quantity of sleep on the clock face, on the 24-hour clock face, at an inappropriate time according to your natural innate preference, and I say that specifically rather than a particular time, you will not get the same quality of your sleep. So an extreme version of this is a night shift worker, where they may get 8 hours of sleep in bed, but they are sleeping during the day, not during the night. So it's a complete reversal. The quality of their sleep is not good. They don't get the same amount of deep sleep, nor do they get the same amount of REM sleep. But let's kind of walk that back a little bit to your scenario, which is much more subtle. Let's say that my chronotype, and your chronotype simply determines whether you're a morning person, an evening person, or somewhere in the middle. About 30% of the population is an extreme morning type or a morning type. About sort of 40% is sort of neither strongly morning or evening, and about the remaining 30% is an evening type. We call them owls and larks. Now, so if you're a morning type, you like to go to bed at, let's say, like 9 p.m. and wake up at 5 or 6. If you're an evening type, you may want to go to bed at 1 a.m. and wake up at 9 a.m. the next morning. So when I'm saying the optimal position of sleep, I'm saying the optimal for your chronotype. Yeah. This is your chronotype. And by the way, it's genetic. You don't get to decide whether you're a morning type or an evening type. It's hardwired into your genes. We know the genes. It's not your fault. If you're an evening type and you're listening to this, and society, which is strongly architected against your chronotype, we reward and we favor the morning types. It is not your fault. It's not a choice. And there's not too much you can do about it. You can push and pull the system by about 30 minutes, 45 minutes, but not much more. So coming back to it, when we position that sleep on that 8-hour period, wherever is optimal for you, you will get a nice distribution. You'll get all of the deep sleep that you want and all of the REM sleep that you want. Earlier in the conversation, I said that we go through these 90-minute cycles, we human beings. It's different for different animals. You always go into deep non-REM sleep first, and then you always have REM sleep second. And that repeats every 90 minutes throughout the night. What changes, however, is the ratio of non-REM to REM within those 90-minute cycles as you move across the night, such that in the first half of the night, the majority of those 90-minute cycles are comprised of lots of deep non-REM sleep and very little REM sleep. In the second half of the night, that balance shifts, and now you get much more REM sleep in the late morning hours and very little deep sleep. The reason I'm saying this is because let's take someone who goes to bed at a standard amount of time. Let's say that they go to bed at midnight and they're going to wake up at 8. But instead, they have to wake up because they've got an early morning meeting. So they go to bed at midnight and they wake up at 6. And my question is, how much sleep have they lost? And your response is, well, they've lost 2 hours out of the 8-hour, which means they've lost 25% of their sleep. And your answer would be right in a way, but it would be wrong as well, which is that they've lost 25% of their total sleep, but they may have lost almost 80% of their REM sleep, because that's the REM-rich phase of the night. And it also works the other way around too, that if you go to bed too late, you will, so what happens is, because of the circadian rhythm, the brain has a different appetite for different stages of sleep on the 24-hour clock face. In the late evening and the early morning hours, the brain has a dietary preference for deep sleep, and it doesn't very much have an appetite taste for REM sleep. Through to the second half of the night, that's when it gets its appetite for REM sleep. So if you start sleeping at 4 o'clock in the morning and you wake up in the middle of the day, your brain has lost its appetite for deep sleep, and so it won't get much. Now, you will probably get much more REM sleep as a consequence. So you've got to be really careful. That's
it's almost like your chronotype may even dictate, in a way, how much deep sleep you may get.
The chronotype will, if you sleep naturally and you get the amount of sleep that you want, your chronotype will probably mean that your circadian rhythm is actually shifted as a chronotype too. So you will still get, as an owl, if you get your 8 hours when you want it, you will probably get a similar sleep architecture as a lark who has gone to bed 5 or 6 hours earlier, because your circadian rhythms are 5 to 6 hours different. But you're right in the sense that owls typically try to go to bed early, but because they are designed not to fall asleep at that time, they're just going to lie in bed. Many owls think that they have insomnia. They don't. They're just not going to bed at the right time, because they get into bed and it's like a teenager whose rhythm is also shifted late. You tell them to go to bed because you've got to wake up for early school start times, but there's nothing they can do because their circadian rhythm is shifted forward in time. And it's the same for owls. So what will happen is that they will probably stay awake for a little while, then they'll get into deep sleep, but then they have to wake up at an earlier time and they will lose a lot of REM sleep. REM sleep for emotional well-being. What do owls typically experience? Depression, low mood, anxiety. So I think we're really starting to put the pieces together on that component.
And for someone like me, I'm somewhere in the middle, like when I don't, pre-baby. Now I guess you would call a lark, because I'm going to bed at like 9. My optimal time, if I can go to bed when my son does, then it's like, if I go to bed at like at 8, then I get the longer duration. That way, if I'm a little more fragmented,
Right.
then I like at least can make up for it.
Otte?
But I'm up at 6 a.m. now. If it were up to me, I'd like to sleep. I usually would wake up at like 8 a.m.
Yes.
Like that's
Yeah,
my
yeah.
natural.
And the reason that you can probably go to
But
sleep
otte
at
til otte?
9 p.m. or even 8 p.m. now is because you're chronically sleep deprived. And as a consequence,
Holy
you've built up
shit.
such a sleep debt
What
that
did you
there is
say?
a lingering what we call sleep pressure in your system. But yeah, I think fighting your chronotype, we've found, comes with deleterious health consequences. Increased risk for poor cardiometabolic outcomes. Things like C-reactive protein is higher. If you look at A1C in terms of sort of your sort of a Rorschach of your blood glucose, your blood sugar, not good. If you look at your propensity for being obese or being overweight, also not great. If you're an owl and you're not sleeping according to your schedule.
Telomeres are shorter.
Telomeres are shorter as well.
So let's talk about because a lot of interesting research has come out of your lab on the blood glucose regulation front, and well, I guess more on the eating preferences and appetite.
It's the way I see it. It's all part of the energy intake expenditure system, and sleep. If you think about it like a weighing scale. Between sort of energy expenditure and energy consumption. Sleep, if you're not getting it, just annihilates that balance. And we can speak about any one of those things. But, I think the blood glucose story and sleep is very, very well worked out now. It started with epidemiological studies where we started to see that people who were sleeping less than 7 hours were at significantly higher likelihood of either being diabetic or going on to develop diabetes. Many of them were already in what we call a pre-diabetic state, or they had what we now call sort of metabolic disorder. And then the question became, well, is that associational or is it causal? So the next studies that happened, and this was work done started in the 1990s by Ev Van Carter at the University of Chicago. Wonderful studies, took a group of healthy people, started to limit them to different doses of sleep for a week. 5 hours of sleep, 6 hours of sleep, 4 hours of sleep. And what she showed was that essentially after 1 week of short sleep, your blood sugar levels are disrupted so significantly that your doctor would classify you at that point as being pre-diabetic after 1 week of short sleep. And the way that they do this is what's called a glucose tolerance test, where you are fasted and then you are given this sickly sweet drink of glucose, and then they are measuring from your blood in the next 3 or 4 hours how quickly is your body able to dispose of that blood glucose. So what happens when you drink or when you eat a meal is that your blood sugar spikes, and you don't want that spike to stick around very long. If your body is healthy, it deals with that raised level of blood glucose very quickly, and it brings it back down very quickly. That's a healthy profile. That's what we call good glucose management. So how good is your body at disposing essentially of that glucose? And the way it disposes it is that cells in the body, including muscle cells, will suck up that glucose. And it's called your disposal index or your disposition index, it turns out. So what she found, Ev Van Carter, with her studies, was that firstly, the way that your body knows how to absorb glucose and suck in that glucose is that there is another chemical called insulin, which is released by the pancreas and beta cells of the pancreas. And that insulin will instruct the cells of the body to open up special glucose channels to absorb the glucose, and your blood sugar drops, which is good and healthy. Firstly, what she found was that when you are not getting sufficient sleep, the beta cells in your pancreas stop being sensitive to the signal of high glucose. So the beta cells, which normally are listening for this spike in glucose, and as soon as they sort of hear, no, they're not hearing it, they're sensing it, but as soon as they sense the spike in glucose, they release insulin. And that insulin will drop your blood glucose. But those cells had become insensitive to glucose, what we call sort of glucose insensitivity. And so the beta cells of the pancreas stopped releasing as much insulin. It didn't release enough insulin to drop blood glucose, so blood glucose remained high. If that wasn't bad enough, we've since gone on to demonstrate, and you can do this with really clever studies, taking tissue biopsies, the cells of the body, including muscle cells and fat cells, their receptors stopped being as sensitive to insulin. So firstly, you're releasing less insulin when you're sleep deprived. Right. But what little insulin you do release is not instructing those cells to open up the channels to take away the monsoon of the glucose that's flowing in the channels of the body. So on both sides of the glucose regulation, on the release of insulin to instruct cells to absorb glucose, and on those cells themselves to be sort of instructed by insulin, those cells became less sensitive to the insulin signal. And so as a consequence, your overall ability to deal with glucose became far more degraded, and blood glucose remained higher, which sets you on a profile of looking pre-diabetic.
Couple that with the standard American diet, and
and you're off to the races in terms of
and eating late at night. So actually, are you familiar with the studies? I know Dr. Sachin Panda actually is the one who told me about this. And melatonin is actually what is responsible for shutting down the pancreatic beta islet cells from producing insulin. So I wonder how much of the sleep deprivation, the melatonin system's involved in that.
Yeah, so in those studies, what was good is that they held constant circadian rhythms, they held constant ambient light, and they even held constant physical activity. The control group was sort of, they were in bed for 8 hours, but the people who were sleep deprived, limited to 4 or 5 hours, during the 8-hour window that the other people were actually sleeping, they had to lie recumbent in bed with no physical movement.
Man.
So you controlled, but it was a great study because you controlled for physical activity as well. So we now really understand the link between a lack of sleep and poor glucose management very, very well indeed. And we also know the stage of sleep that's important. It's again, deep slow wave sleep. The study that I described before, where you're playing those annoying tones just below the level of awakening, so I can remove your deep quality of sleep. You can do that same thing again, and you essentially produce that same diabetic-like consequence just by removing or excising deep slow wave sleep.
So you're doing that, and then on top of that, some of your work has shown that you're now also going to have a preference to eat the very food that raises your blood sugar levels, right?
Yep.
And so it's something I've definitely
high glycemic.
Yeah.
So this is a whole. So it all fits in, I think, to this energy balance. So, firstly, what we know is that your regulation of blood sugar, of blood glucose, is profoundly impaired by a lack of sleep. But what about your calorie intake? What about your obesogenic profile, setting aside your glycemic profile? So what we've discovered is that when you're not getting enough sleep, two appetite-regulating hormones go in opposite directions. These two hormones are called leptin and ghrelin, and I often, think of them as they sound like hobbits to me, at least. Leptin and ghrelin. That J.R. Tolkien would have written about them, but they're not. They're real hormones. Leptin is a hormone that signals satiety. What I mean by that is when you have high amounts of leptin, it tells your brain you're full, you're satisfied with your food, you don't want to eat anymore. Ghrelin is the other hunger hormone. When ghrelin is increased, you feel unsatisfied by your food, you feel hungry, and you want to eat more. So after you eat a meal, normally what happens is that levels of leptin increase, and levels of ghrelin, the hunger hormone, you can think of ghrelin as like a grumbling tummy, ghrelin goes down. And this means that you stop eating, you don't want to eat anymore, and you're full for a duration of time period. When you are sleep deprived, levels of leptin, which normally signal to your brain you're full and you're satisfied with food, that hormone is impaired by a lack of sleep. So you lose the fullness, satiety signal in your brain. If that wasn't bad enough, the hunger hormone, ghrelin, actually increases. So it's a double whammy effect here. Right. What does that lead to? It leads to a strong obesogenic profile of energy consumption, of food consumption. So what we, and Ev Van Carter, in fact, has done all of these pioneering studies, and we've done some of them now too. Typically, you tend to overeat during main meals. So you will typically eat somewhere between about 200 to 300 extra calories if we give you a meal and we measure all of the food on your plate and we ask how much did you eat at that one sitting. you tend to overeat by about 200 or 300 calories per main meal sitting.
Wow.
Now, you could say, well, actually,
that's after a full night of sleep.
Well, that's when you've been limited to maybe 4 hours of sleep for a week. Now, the reviewers of these papers, in the early days said, well, that's because when you're awake longer, being awake is more metabolically demanding, and you're probably moving around more. Not true. It turns out sleep, firstly, is a remarkably metabolically active state. You're very active when you're metabolically when you're asleep. In fact, the difference between being asleep versus being awake is only about, for a whole night of sleep, the difference of about 140 calories.
Wow.
It's like a small cookie, essentially. So yes, when you're awake longer, you do burn more calories. But the amount of calories that you increase in your intake far exceeds anything that you expend by way of being awake a little bit longer. If that wasn't bad enough, though, it's not the main meal where the trouble lies with sleep. That's some of the problem. The other studies that are even more sort of devilish are where you give these sleep-deprived subjects the same meal, but then you give them a snack bar. And it's an ad lib food buffet, essentially. And you can eat as much as you want. And they allow you to eat in a room by yourself, so there's no social pressure. So you don't restrict your eating, or it's just true eating. And of course, we measure everything that you eat. And it's snacking that is the dead giveaway here. You end up eating 300 to 400 additional calories by way of snacks. This is after they've eaten a 2,000 calorie meal in one sitting. They will then go away and they will eat an additional 400 calories at the snack bar. Wow. So as a consequence, what you're doing is you're increasing the total caloric intake, which sets you on a path towards being overweight and obese. Then the discovery came that it's not just what you eat, it's not just how much you eat, but it's what you eat. And what Eve Van Carter discovered in her early studies was that if you give one of these sort of food buffets, and you can eat anything, it goes from sugary treats to salty treats like pretzels or potato chips, to heavy-hitting stodgy carbohydrates, breads, pasta, pizza, all the way to salad. What you find is that you eat more of all of the food groups, but you eat mostly, in terms of an increase, the stodgy, heavy-hitting carbohydrates as well as the sugary foods. And if we know anything from the recent movement in food, particularly from people like Gary Taubes, who's written wonderfully about this type of stuff, that's the food that sets you on a path, again, down an obesogenic and also a poor glycemic control profile. If you look at all of the cardiometabolic markers of health, when you're eating excessive carbohydrate, heavy, rich, and particularly simplified sugars, they're bad for your health profile in general. It's exactly the foods that you eat when you're underslept.
Is there a feedback loop on those foods affecting your sleep?
There is.
There is.
So I would say this is probably, apart from maybe the gut microbiome, of which there is now some evidence, and we're starting to look at this too at the Sleep Center, it's probably the least well understood. But the bottom line is that if you're eating a diet that's high in carbohydrate, especially high in processed simple sugars, and low in fiber, you tend to have worse sleep. You take longer time to fall asleep. The amount of deep sleep that you get is less, and you have more fragmented awakenings throughout the night. Now, I don't think there's enough evidence right now for me to hang my hat on any dietary prescription for sleep. In 5 years' time, I think we'll have a very different conversation. I think absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I think we'll get there, and I think food is going to be a big part of that equation. I think the gut microbiome too. I think that's what we've seen. When in a few of the studies where you limit people, you sleep deprive them, or you put them on a jet lag routine, you see the balance between the sort of Bacteroidetes sort of class of the microbiome versus the Firmicutes. That ratio goes in a balance that you don't want. So typically in sort of obese people or people with diabetes, you get a higher ratio of the Firmicutes relative to the Bacteroidetes. when you modulate sleep and you shortchange sleep or you put sleep on a jet-like profile, that's exactly the same gut microbiome sort of dysregulation profile that you see. Wow. So I think it's going to be a great, and I think part of
they're on their own circadian rhythm as well, the bacteria.
They are, and yeah.
So is that why? Because their ratio is changing?
I think it's possible that it could be a circadian rhythm. I think it's also possible that it could be down to what we described before, which is the fight or flight branch of the nervous system. That when you are underslept, it's like revving a car, but in neutral. It's desperately bad for the engine. That's what happens when you're sleep deprived. You get this ramping up of your fight or flight system, and it just stays there with chronic sleep deprivation for as long as you're chronically sleep deprived. And 1 out of every 2 adults in first world nations is chronically sleep deprived. I think it leads to a release of stress chemistry, particularly cortisol. Cortisol is known in the gut microbiome to produce this imbalance. What's the pathway? I think it's probably a bunch of nerve fibers from the brain into the body called the vagus nerve, and we're starting to do a lot of work on this now. I think the vagus nerve we know has a direct mainline pathway, or provides a mainline pathway from your brain to your gut. And that's why there is a very powerful brain-gut relationship. I think that's one of the mechanisms by which the gut is affected by sleep, which gets me excited because if that's true, flip the equation. Could the gut microbiome be a path through which we can reverse engineer a signal for better sleep in the brain? Yeah. I think that now becomes a parsimonious hypothesis, and it's one that I'd like to test as well.
There was a really interesting study looking at the effects of a particular strain. I think it was the Rhamnosus strain of they produce GABA in the gut.
Yes.
But GABA doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier as far as I think most evidence suggests it does not.
No. But so the brain has GABA, but it's not coming from the brain.
Right. Yep. But there was some studies that were sort of speculating that there's through the vagal nerve, because some of the afferent neurons in the gut were stimulating it, and they were more like relaxed or something. They were producing GABA in the brain through the vagal nerve, and GABA affects sleep, right? So there'd be some, it sounds like there could definitely be some sort of interesting.
And that's one of the I think the things in anxiety that we see is that it's a failure of the brain to dampen down and basically invoke inhibition throughout the brain to quiet down these regions.
That particular strain of probiotics was shown to help with anxiety. Small trials, clinical trials in humans. Of course, the initial studies were preclinical in animals. But it has been shown to actually help improve anxiety.
It does?
Yeah.
My guess is that if that's true, if you were to look at sleep, I would be surprised not to see a sleep benefit by way of an anxiety reduction. I mean, in my lab, that's probably one of the most reliable things that we see when we deprive people of sleep, of any dose.
That the anxiety goes up?
Anxiety goes up. And it's almost, we've done the dose response curve. We've looked, hour by hour by hour. And as soon as you get past probably about 14 or 15 hours of wakefulness, anxiety starts to increase. The further you go into that sleep deprivation period, the more anxious that you get. It's a very robust, reliable effect.
So what do you think, it sounds like if you were to give people like some of the main things, the main interventions they can do to help improve their sleep. A lot of people are interested in prevention. A lot of people listening and watching are really interested, including myself, in prevention. And it sounds like things that lower anxiety are obviously important.
Critical.
Yeah, for improving sleep.
Yeah, I think the prescription I would have. Well, firstly, I think it's good to recognize sort of those 4 pillars of sleep.
Yeah.
That depth, duration, continuity, regularity. But I think there are 5 actionable things that people could do tonight to start getting better sleep, and we've mentioned many of them. The first is darkness. You really do need some degree of darkness at night to release that hormone melatonin, which helps trigger the timing and the healthy onset of sleep.
And you would say about maybe 4 hours before your bedtime, or what would you say?
Yeah, I would say 3 to 4 hours is the time to start thinking about your light saturation exposure, certainly in the last hour before bed. And there are ways that you can do that. You can install software on your computer if you really have to look at it. But I would advise against that because I think computers cause and trigger anxiety. I think, in fact, if anything, my estimation right now is that the blue light from those screens is detrimental. I think the evidence is favoring a blockade of melatonin and a reduction in REM sleep. They did this great study. They took